The pressure warning had been singing for 6 minutes when Yara Cho made the decision that would cost her career and save humanity's most important discovery. She was 23 years old, the youngest member of the Terran subsurface expedition vessel Ardent Meridian Science crew, and she was 4 kilometers beneath the ice of Ganymede's southern shelf in a one-person dive pod the size of a cargo container. The pod was rated to 9 kilometers. At kilometer 4, the starboard thruster assembly had begun to fail, and the navigation computer had gone into automated ascent protocol, meaning it wanted to go up, right now, without the 6 terabytes of acoustic data currently buffering in the mission recorder. Yara turned off the ascent protocol. She heard Commander Vasic's voice through the comm almost immediately. "Cho, that was not a request." "I know, sir." She kept her hands on the thruster controls, holding position 30 meters above the contact horizon, the thermal boundary where Ganymede's subsurface ocean met the underside of the ice shelf. "I've got the contact array still active and the recorder running. Give me 4 more minutes. Your starboard thrust is at 31%. If it drops below 20, you cannot ascend on the primary axis." "I know." Yara. Vasic never used her first name. The fact that he was using it now told her exactly how bad the thruster readings looked from the surface relay. She looked at her secondary display, where the acoustic data was still painting itself in real time, slow, intricate, layered patterns building in the water column below her. Not ambient thermal noise, not tectonic percussion, something that had started as a single repeating pulse at 3.7 kilohertz and had in the past 12 minutes become a conversation. 4 minutes, she said, then I'll ascend. The silence from the relay was the kind that meant the commander was deciding whether to override her remotely. He had the authority. She had locked out the easy override by physically disconnecting the automatic ascent toggle, a violation of Dive Protocol Section 11C, and she had done it calmly and with full awareness of the disciplinary consequences, because the alternative was losing the data. The mission had started 8 months ago aboard the Ardent Meridian, a deep survey vessel assigned to Ganymede's subsurface characterization program. The science team included Commander Vasic, Dr. Eves the mission biologist, Soph the acoustic sensor specialist, and 3 others, and Yara, whose official designation was Junior Xenological Analyst, a title that had not existed before this mission because there had never been anything on Ganymede to analyze xenologically. Her job was to watch for anomalies the automated systems weren't programmed to flag, anomalies that didn't look like geology. She had been watching for 8 months. She had found them 47 minutes ago. The contact array below her pod was a cluster of directional hydrophones suspended on monofilament at the thermal boundary, the exact zone where liquid water met solid ice, and the heat gradients Dr. Eves had been calling theoretically hospitable for 7 years before anyone put a ship in orbit to check. Yara had deployed the array on Dive 14, same as the previous 13. Lower it, record for 4 hours, retrieve, go home. Nothing on those 13 dives had distinguished itself from ambient data. On Dive 14, at the 90-minute mark, the array had returned a pulse at 3.7 kilohertz. She had almost flagged it as a thermal boundary artifact, a known pressure oscillation, but the pulse had duration. It lasted 0.4 seconds, stopped for 1.1 seconds, and repeated. It did not drift the way thermal artifacts drifted. It stayed at exactly 3.7 kilohertz for 11 repetitions, and then it changed. The change was small, a shift of approximately 40 hertz, holding for 3 pulses, then returning to baseline. Yara had played the shift 6 times on her headphones before calling Soph to pull the acoustic spectrum analysis without telling her why. Soph had returned in 8 minutes with a finding that her voice could not quite flatten. The shift matched, to within acceptable error margins, the frequency ratio of Ganymede's own tidal resonance period. Whatever was producing the pulse had encoded a reference to its own environment inside the signal. It knew where it was. It was telling them where it was. That was 41 minutes ago. In the 33 minutes since, the signal had expanded from a single repeating pulse into something Soph was calling a cascade layered frequencies, branching internal patterns, a structure that built on the tidal resonance key the way a sentence builds on its subject. It was still going. The recorder was still capturing it, and Yara's starboard thruster was at 29% and dropping. Cho, Vasic's voice was very controlled, 29 on the starboard. I see it. 3 minutes. I'm giving you 3 minutes and then I'm overriding the relay lock remotely. Walk me through what you have. She looked at the acoustic display. It's a cascade signal, layered at minimum 4 distinct frequency bands building internal structure. It encoded the tidal resonance period as a reference key in the first minutes. It is not geological. It is not mechanical. It is structured in the way a language is structured, except I cannot parse it yet because I only have 41 minutes of data and the structure is still developing. She paused. Sir, whatever is in this ocean has been here longer than we have been a species. It found us on dive 14 because we were loud enough to find. It is answering. The silence on the line was different this time, not decision-making silence, something rawer. Soph has the relay feed, Vasic said. Yes, she's logging everything I'm logging. So even if he stopped. Even if I have to abort without completing the buffer, she has the upstream relay data. Yara's hands were steady on the thruster controls, but the relay feed is compressed. The pod recorder is lossless. There's a difference in what we'll be able to reconstruct. I know the difference. Then you know why I'm still here. The starboard thruster indicator dropped to 27. The navigation computer, disconnected from the override toggle, was silent and resentful in its corner of the interface. All its instincts pointing upward, all its authority revoked by a 23-year-old who had made a decision it could not countermand. Below the pod, in the dark kilometers of ocean that no sunlight had ever touched, something was speaking into the water at 3.7 kilohertz and 17 harmonics, and Yara Cho was listening. She thought about the word xenological. She had been given that title as a placeholder for a possibility, a professional hedge against a future the expedition's planners had thought unlikely but not impossible. Dr. Eves had designed the contact array for this purpose, had argued for it against a committee that called it extravagant. 8 months ago, when Yara first arrived on the Ardent Meridian, Eves had looked at her and said, "You're the one who'll actually need to use this thing." She hadn't known if that was a prediction or a hope. Eves was on the surface relay. He had not spoken since Soph confirmed the cascade was still building. Yara imagined him with headphones on, eyes on the spectrum display, watching the frequencies branch. 24% on the starboard. The pod shuddered a small lateral movement, the asymmetric thrust expressing itself in the water as the compromised thruster failed to hold position against the boundary current. Yara compensated with the port thruster and felt the pod settle. Cho, Vasic's voice had dropped. 24. I know. What's your ascent window at 20%? She had run the calculation 3 times. At 20% starboard thrust, her ascent angle narrowed to approximately 16 degrees from vertical. She'd have to corkscrew up through the ice channel rather than ascending straight, doubling her ascent time, bringing her to the minimum safe threshold from the shelf with about 45 seconds to spare. If the thruster held at 20. I can make it at 20, she said. That's not comfortable margin. No, it isn't. The signal below her sent a new pattern, something she had not heard in the previous 46 minutes. A longer sustained tone at the base frequency, followed by a rapid series of short pulses climbing the harmonic series in a way that felt, even without analysis, like a rising question. She didn't have the framework to parse it. No one did yet. But she had 6 terabytes of lossless data that someone someday would be able to parse, and every second she held position added to that 6 terabytes. 22%. The thruster was dropping faster. Initiating ascent, Yara said. The words came out because they were the correct words. She had run the numbers, and the numbers had produced the threshold, and the threshold had been crossed. She pulled the contact array up on its retrieval line, hand over hand on the motor control, watching the depth meter as the array cleared the thermal boundary. And then the starboard thruster dropped to 19. Not gradually. It had been declining by fractions, and then it stepped down in one clean drop, a component failure, not a fade, and the pod lurched to starboard, and the contact array retrieval line went taut at an angle. Yara corrected with port thrust. She got the pod level. The array motor had stopped, the lurch had jammed the retrieval line in the guide channel. The array hung below the pod, half retrieved, still live, still recording. The pod was stable on compensated port thrust, but the thruster differential was now severe enough that ascent would require angling 30 degrees, threading the ice channel at an angle it had not been tested for. Cho, Vasik's voice was clipped. I'm reading 19 on starboard and a retrieval jam. Array is still live, still recording. You need to release the array and ascend. The array release was a single control, a monofilament cutter that would drop the entire assembly into the dark below. It would fall to the ocean floor, still recording into its onboard buffer, transmitting nothing because the relay was 4 kilometers up. The buffer would fill in approximately 90 minutes and then loop. Whatever it recorded would be lost. Yara looked at the release control. She looked at the thruster readout, 19%. She looked at the mission recorder, where the current capture was at 6.2 terabytes of lossless data, and at the relay upstream counter, where SOF's compressed feed sat at 4.1 terabytes. The difference between those two numbers represented the acoustic detail that would allow a future linguist, someone Yara's age, sitting somewhere warm and pressurized, with the full data set in front of them, to do what Yara could not do yet. Find the grammar in the cascade, decode the reference key, understand what had been said into the dark water of Ganymede's ocean on this specific Tuesday in April. She made the decision the same way she had made every decision in the past 47 minutes, without drama, because the math had already done the work. She cut the retrieval line manually, dropping the jammed section and letting the array hang free on remaining monofilament below the pod. This removed the jam and freed the retrieval motor. The array now trailed 20 meters below her, complicating the ascent angle. She recalculated. The math was bad but not impossible. Then she hit the emergency data burst, a function she had never used, that nobody on the mission had ever used, which compressed the pod's full 6.2 terabyte lossless buffer at maximum lossy ratio and transmitted it to the relay in 40 seconds. The quality was worse than lossless. It was better than the compressed relay feed SOF already had. She initiated ascent at 31 degrees from vertical, the contact array trailing below her, the starboard thruster holding at 18%. It had dropped one more point during the burst, and the pod system screaming in 3 different alert tones that she was in violation of approximately 11 sections of dive protocol. I have your burst, SOF said. Her voice was not professional. It was the voice of someone who had just received something they hadn't expected to survive. All 6.2 terabytes. Quality index 0.73. It's readable, Yara. It's all readable. Good. Yara held the ascent angle. The pod threaded the lower ice channel. Tell Dr. Eves. He's right here. He's been here the whole time. Eves' voice came through, quiet and rough-edged. Yara. The cascade is still transmitting on the relay feed. Whatever is down there is still sending. I know. I'm sorry I had to leave it. Don't be. A pause. Don't be sorry for anything. The ascent took 19 minutes. The starboard thruster held at 16% by the time she cleared the ice shelf, barely inside the minimum safe threshold. The contact array trailing below the pod still recording until the water ended, and the ice gave way to vacuum, and the hydrophones went silent. Commander Vasek met her at the docking lock personally. He helped her out of the pod seat without speaking and stood in the airlock while she got her legs back under her, and then he said, "You violated 11 protocols." 12, she said. "I counted on the way up." He looked at her for a long moment. "The data burst alone will take 8 months to analyze. The lossless segments will take years." "I know." The question it asked, if that's what it was, the question at minute 46. "We can probably reconstruct a response." She hadn't thought about that yet. She stood in the airlock with her legs unsteady from 4 kilometers of pressure and let the idea settle in her chest. Not the fear of what it might mean, not the weight of the protocols she had broken, but the specific, irreducible fact of it. Something in the dark below Ganymede's ice had found them on dive 14, had answered their noise with structure, had built a language in real time from a reference key it had encoded itself. And now humanity had 6.2 terabytes of that language, good enough to decode, good enough to answer. The worth of knowing had never been abstract to her. It was the reason she had taken the placement, trained for the dives, asked for the contact array specifications before she had clearance to read them. She had understood at 23 that the question of whether anyone else was out there was the oldest question the species had ever asked, and that the answer, the real answer, in acoustic data, in a lossless buffer, in a cascade signal still transmitting into a cold and lightless ocean, was worth any price that came with it. She would face the protocol's review, the committee, the career consequences. She had known she would face them when she disconnected the ascent toggle. She had made the decision anyway, because the data was going home, and because somewhere in that dark and ancient ocean, something was still sending, patient and deliberate, into water that had held its silence for longer than humanity had been alive to listen. And now they had heard it. And now they would answer. That was enough. That was, in every way that mattered, everything.